is a MARii podcast.
All right, hello guys, welcome back to MARii Mobility World. We're part of the Plug-in with MARii podcast network. I'm Azara Tagaya, your host for today's podcast session. Now, before we start, we'd like to say thank you to all our listeners for listening to all our episodes where we always strive to give you the best in technological developments and the latest trends in Malaysia's industries. More episodes are coming your way, so don't forget to subscribe to Plug-in with MARii, that's MARII, on any of your favorite platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. So today we have an interesting topic. We're talking about the auto industry in Malaysia. We're going to take a little look back at the auto industry's history, but also more importantly, we want to look to the future and also see what the future holds for us. And for that, we are joined by two very respected senior journalists in the auto industry in Malaysia. We are joined by Chips Yap and also Yamin Bong. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, morning.
Hi. Okay, so you guys are very respected journalists, senior legend writers in the auto field. But before we jump into your experiences writing about cars and vehicles in Malaysia, would it be okay if we want to take a little look back, a brief rewind, and see when you started writing and what actually got you into writing about cars, and what publication or website are you attached to now? Can we start with you, Mr. Chips?
Okay, I've been covering the motor industry for the past 44 years. So that's around 1977 that I started. And actually, I was studying to be an architect. But, drawing lines is very boring. And I think driving cars is a lot more interesting. Fortunately, my dad was agreeable to me changing to journalism. And so I got there. And once I got into journalism, I thought I'd better specialize in something. And since I was interested in cars, that was where I got into. And so I followed the industry since 1977 until now, and I've seen how it evolved with the national car coming out and all. Of course, I started in the print age, so I was doing magazines and newspaper writing in the early years, and then moved into the digital age in 2000, and went through various websites. And now I'm at piston.my, one of the motoring websites in Malaysia. So that's where I am, and I guess that's all I've been doing for most of my working life. Unlike Yamin, who was actually a business reporter, and then he decided to come and join our side of the fence. Over to you, Yamin.
I see that. So Yamin Wong, I'm now contributing to Free Malaysia Today, FMT, and I started writing in 1980 after my university Malaya, where I graduated with statistics in economics, and Rafida Aziz was my lecturer. And so I've been writing since 1980 in Business Times, and then from where? From 20. Then I was writing 2010 to 2016. I started with the New State Times with my own bosses, Kadir Jassin, and we started the cars, bikes, and trucks in the New State Times. And actually, like Chip said, we love to drive and we love to ride. So I thought I would continue writing even after I stopped my business in CBT, where I was a editor. And along the way of journalism, I took a 7-year break to do environmental management. Okay, I was doing heavy metal waste recovery, and also for about 3 years, I was managing about a fleet of about 100 solid waste trucks. So I was a Sampa man for about 3-4 years. So I really loved the waste management industry because it's so meaningful. You don't understand, but when you are the Sampa man, you are very involved with the customers and about waste generation. And then when your truck doesn't get to the customer side, they get very angry. So you
what Sampa was this? I mean, this was the household Sampa or different?
Yeah, this was solid waste management. We had a council contracts. That means we contract to the council, the MPPJ, and we also had commercial waste contracts where we go to individual factories they appoint us because these are big container loads of industrial waste, industrial and commercial waste, which MPPJ doesn't do. So I think I have the benefit of being a businessman in a very tough industry, and also being a journalist with the newspaper, which was in the 1980s, the very powerful and glamorous newspaper. And that's where we met Chips. When I started in 1980, I was a cadet reporter, and all the senior reporters said, "Hey, the Toyota is launching a car. Hey, young man, you go lah. What you doing? You doing nothing? You go lah." So all my seniors were going to Bank Negara, Ministry of Finance. I'm the young punk lah. So I love that lah. So we met in 1980 as a cadet reporter. This was my senior. He started in 1976. And I remember we went to the first, as a group, Malaysian reporters as a group went to the first Tokyo Motor Show. Yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
I see. Fantastic. Now, so you mentioned that Chips, you've been writing since 1977, and Yamin, you've been writing since 1980. Let me start with you first, Chips. So in 1977, when you first started writing about cars, what was the auto scene in Malaysia like then? What was the consumer sentiment about vehicles like? And what about the vehicles in 1977 that actually drew you to have this interest in the auto industry and writing about vehicles?
Well, in 1977, that would have been 10 years after the auto industry started to localize, when the government wanted people to assemble locally. So 77 was, I think the 70s were a time when the industry was really starting to pick up, and motorization of the country started in the 60s, just like in Japan. So it was a good time when the government announced that they wanted local assembly, because people were wanting cars, people could afford cars, our young economy was becoming strong. And so by the 1970s, I think one distinct thing would be to say that the Japanese brands began to take over the market. Before that, say up to the late 1960s, it was all the European brands which had been around a long time. But then from the 1970s onwards, you started to see the Japanese brands. And one of the things that people remember is that the Japanese brands in the 60s were considered, we always talk about the Milo tin thing, where the cars were very thin and fragile, which was partly true. But the Japanese worked very hard to prove that their cars could be reliable, economical, and efficient and durable. And that was a very strong impression that was made on Malaysians. So they started buying Japanese cars. And you've got to remember that that generation of people buying, many of them, like my parents, went through World War II when there was some bad memories of the Japanese being in Malaysia. So in spite of that and the bad memories, they still favored Japanese cars increasingly. And that saw the wave of Japanese cars starting to flow over not just Malaysia, but the region and then the world, and taking over the market, and the industry was growing then. I think it was a very good time for me to get into it and cover the industry and document its development.
Yeah, what was the Milo Tin story all about? I heard that people said if your car broke down or got into an accident and then you send it to the workshop, they will actually patch it up with Milo Tins. Is that right? Or is it just like a myth?
That story actually, I came across it over the years, and I talked to many of the older timers, workshop people and all, and they confirmed that there was a time when people repaired cars. If you have an accident and there's a hole in the car, they'll maybe cut it off, and then the way they close up the hole is, at the time we didn't have proper materials probably, so they would find whatever metal there was, and probably there were a lot of old Milo tins, and back in those days, Milo tins were very durable, very
I see.
thick metal. So they probably flatten it and then cut it into a square or whatever, and then welded it on and then painted over. Now, the
Mm.
story about the Milo tin body would have come about because later on, maybe somebody had another accident and then the paint got scraped off, and then they scrape off and then they see the word Milo underneath. And they get a shock like, alamak, in Japan also they use Milo to go and make the car. And so that's how it spread, I guess. But it is true in a sense,
I see.
although I think it was just for a short period. After that, the workshop started to do things properly.
I see. I thought that was something like an urban legend or something like that. That's amazing to know that that actually happened. Okay, Yamin, what about you? In terms of car technology, how has it shifted from when you started riding in the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s until now? What's the biggest difference or biggest change in the progress of car technology?
I think we are now on the cusp of a very big change. Yeah? The history, of course, we know because is you can repair a car, just a carburetor and you just need to repair the carburetor or the spark ignition. So it's just very mechanical. And then you could repair cars without any computers. But now you need computers and onboard diagnostics to repair cars. But going beyond that, we must understand we have a very important mega trend now, which is the European Union last month in July, they already have detailed out their fit for 55. Fit for 55 means 55% reduction in carbon emissions. So now we are on a very big trend of decarbonization. Decarbonization. And you know why decarbonization? Because we are having climate change. We are having climate change. We are having extreme weather. It's going to be a very big cost to the world. And when the European Union says that they want to decarbonize up to 55% reduction of carbon by the middle of this century, 2050, what does it mean? European Union is one of the three world's biggest car markets. So when the European Union said they don't want any more exhaust emissions by 2030 and by 2050, two steps, the world is going to start making cars for this. Why do you think the whole world is going to EVs? Not because of love for environment. Nobody loves the environment when they have to pay money for it. So what the European Union is doing is forcing everybody to make EVs. Every car brand now has an EV range. Every car brand. And if they don't have an EV range, they already have made public announcement. They're going to have they're only going to make EVs by 2030, and by 2050, they're going to do so many things. Look, now, and we are in ASEAN and we are in Malaysia, we are not even talking about this. Hey, we are in beneath we are in now a very, very big problem because we are not addressing this mega trend which Thailand is addressing and Indonesia addressing. That is what I'm very concerned about as a journalist. The mega trend, decarbonization, and we are not there. We are not there.
Chips, do you have anything to add to what Yamin just said just now about the concerns concerning the auto industry?
Yeah, I mean, I share his concern. Having seen that the auto industry in Malaysia, now this is going back to the 60s, I've always said that at that time, and at least up till maybe the 1980s, Malaysia was the best place in Southeast Asia for any manufacturer to set up car operations, car manufacturing operations. And I say that because we had a good education system, we had an educated workforce, we had a good infrastructure, we were more advanced, with no offense to our neighbors. We were more advanced than other countries. Perhaps Singapore was the only one, but Singapore was quite small and not interested in the car industry. So, in terms of making cars, Malaysia was the best place in the region to do so. And you think about it, um, manufacturers could set up very easily, and they did. When the government called them to assemble, many of them responded, could set up very easily because, like European car manufacturers, they set up a plant. They don't have to worry about language issues. English being the common language, all our workforce were very familiar with it. No need to translate manuals into English. Um, Training is much easier because it can be conducted in a common language. So it was a very good for Malaysia at that time when we started. And I just feel sad that we are not ahead of Thailand and Indonesia today. They've beaten us in spite of having that good start. And along the way, there were many reasons why that has happened. But partly too, it has to be recognized that our vehicle population, the size of the market, is actually not that big. We have a rest. We don't have a big population now. Only it's 30 million. Back then, what it was 17 million or something like that. So we don't have enough people to buy cars domestically to support uh, car industry, a car making industry uh, in a healthy manner. Unlike, say, Thailand and Indonesia, just their domestic population alone, they can support car making, and then on top of which, they get the economies of scale. So they also went into exports. We can't even go into exports because our factories don't have enough volume to start with. And the cars made here tend to be more expensive to the manufacturers. So we've slipped back. And if you ask me, should we have gone into it? Well, we went into it, so there's no point. We can't change history. But personally, I feel that we could have perhaps considered going into component manufacturing and become a hub of component manufacturing to supply car assembly plants instead. That one doesn't rely on just the domestic market, we can supply to the whole world. Whereas cars, the manufacturers want to see a domestic market that is big enough uh, to support the factory they build. You can't tell them build your factory in Malaysia and export, because they'll say, why do I need to do it in Malaysia? I can do it in Thailand, I can do it in my home country. I don't need to do it in Malaysia. So, but components are in great demand by every plant, and we could have got into that business and become a leader in it. So
So you say we could have. Do you think there's still space for us to do so in the future? Can Malaysia be more competitive, and how? Do we have the skill set? Do we have the human resources to maybe go into that later? Do you
I
think?
think the world has changed so much today, and since the 1980s, the auto industry has gone for globalization, global sourcing. So they buy their parts from where it's the cheapest, of course, with quality as well. But they they look at mega factories that they can set up in a country where the incentives are good, the policies are good, and then they export from there. And because in globalization, uh, export trade is a bit more free nowadays, manufacturers take advantage of it, just like AFTA. With AFTA, at least we can export within ASEAN freely, uh, and Malaysian companies have a chance. Without AFTA, we would become very isolated and still not have the economies of scale. So at least AFTA has helped our industry in some way.
Indeed. Okay, so with that being said, I'll open this question to both of you. What do you think are some of the trends and developments in the auto industry that we will be seeing in the years to come? Yamin, would you like to take this one?
Yamin can go.
I think we should now focus clearly on the future, which is decarbonization. I don't think any automotive policy will survive if we don't have the objective of decarbonization. Clearly, we must have a big industrial master plan where we talk about decarbonization. And that means all vehicles need to be EVs eventually. New vehicles made should be EVs. That is a world trend. The narrative on Malaysia is already very bad, The US says we are the worst for human trafficking.
Mm.
The European Union says our oil palm industry is very polluting and deforestation. I think we better get this straight. We must get the narrative on Malaysia straight. We should have an industrial policy that focuses clearly on decarbonization. So we should have an industrial policy that focuses on decarbonization, and then auto policy will follow that. Congruent to that, we must have a hydrogen economy. Hydrogen economy means what? Hydrogen is many kinds of hydrogen. You have brown hydrogen, you have blue hydrogen, you have green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is from renewable resources like solar, wind, and hydropower. Okay, and what the world wants to do, what not the world lah. Japan and Korea are very clearly on hydrogen for electric vehicles, fuel
Mm.
cells. And in Europe is already coming to be the world's largest EV market because of the European Union and their Fit for 55 declaration. And in Europe, they have car companies like Mercedes-Benz and BMW focusing on fuel cells. Okay, it's very futuristic, maybe 10, 15 years, but it's already happening. And Toyota has, because Toyota is Japanese and Toyota is very strongly committed to, of course, its home country. So Toyota and Japan are very strongly on to hydrogen. So we must have a hydrogen party, in Malaysia. We better have a hydrogen party, a political party called Hydrogen Party, where the only religion is decarbonization and hydrogen. And don't think I'm just being very futuristic here. In ASEAN,
Mm.
there's only one country with hydrogen transport, and that's happening in Sarawak. Sarawak is our champion of hydrogen because Sarawak it is the center of the SCORE, so Sarawak SCORE, no? Sarawak Corridor of Renewable Energy, SCORE. Sarawak Corridor of Renewable Energy, and there are 3 hydrogen fuel buses running in Kuching. Pilot project, only one in Malaysia, only one in ASEAN. So we must have now we also must find a female leader to lead this party. Why a female leader? Because women are caring, They caring, Mother looks after children. Father never
Yeah.
looks after children. Father will he will enjoy lah. We might have a female, and we have 4, 5 nice female leaders who can be our patron for this hydrogen party for the future. That's my view lah.
Okay, so that's your view. I mean, what about you, Chips? What do you think the car of the future will look like? Or do you agree with Yamin that we should have a hydrogen party and a female leader?
Well, the thing about car of the future is whether you're talking about Malaysia or you're talking about globally. Globally, obviously, we are going towards electric cars. There's no escaping from that. But I think you're more focused on what's going to happen in Malaysia, right? And right now, I feel that Malaysia is really slipping back because everyone else, or almost everyone else around us, has already had policies that clearly define a route for the manufacturers to use or to follow. And what it says is that they must electrify their range because, well, emission regulations are going to become stricter, just like Europe, and other issues like safety and all will also become stricter. So manufacturers understand this roadmap, and that is what they want. And you got to understand, investments in the auto industry take covered for a 10-year period or 8-year period at least. They plan well in advance. But what the Malaysian government sometimes forgets is that people need time to plan, and they do not think far ahead enough and provide a roadmap that is far enough for manufacturers to work with. And they sort of think like, okay, this year we announced that next year we're going to go EV and everybody can just go EV. But there's a lot of things involved to make the transition, and manufacturers want to know and be certain that changes that are requested will stick. You know, like in Thailand, if you observe their policy making, they make a lot of policies over a 10-year term, and governments come and go. Thailand changes prime ministers very often. They can't keep track of who they are. Governments change, but the policies remain. I remember someone in Isuzu telling me 10 years earlier they had talked about upgrading the diesel standard. And in that 10 years, the governments changed, but the policy never changed. And manufacturers had made investments that they would make engines to meet that new standard at the target date. And the target date was met in spite of a very different government being in place. With our government, manufacturers have told me that they follow one policy now, a new government comes in, changes the policy, and they have to start all over again. And for the guy in Malaysia who is making any proposals to his head office to make investments, it is very tough because he says, okay, put 10 million in, and then after that, the program changes or the policy changes, and they say, you know, what the hell is going on? Let's put the money somewhere else. And that actually happened once in early 2000. Ford had planned to make Malaysia a hub for one of its models, an ASEAN hub, to assemble a model here to supply in ASEAN under the after free trade agreement. And then Malaysia suddenly said, no, we will not open the market on time. That means Malaysia will not enjoy the duty-free export privilege that was allowed under AFTA. And Ford was so frustrated, they had made plans to make Malaysia one of their production hubs, as the Malaysian government really loves to see. And they had to tear up the plans and they put the money into the Philippines instead. And we lost an opportunity to become a production hub. So that's the sort of thing that happens. And with EV, we find that there's a lot of talk by the government. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And what really discourages people is this thing always of customized incentives. They are always told, yeah, do come and talk to us. We always can discuss and negotiate. I think what manufacturers want is an open announcement of what are the incentives applicable to everyone in the same way. They don't want to feel like their rival might get a better deal than them. So why are they fools to invest? So I think before we can talk about the future, policies need to come to a new approach.
Indeed, agree. Now, also looking to the future, let's say in 1 or 2 years to come, especially now where we have this pandemic situation as well, which has put a stall to car production and also car consumption. Will vehicle prices increase in the next 1 to 2 years? And if yes, how many percent of an increase do you think? What will be the average car prices for Malaysians in the coming years? What do you think? I'll start with you first, Chips.
Car prices, it's a supply and demand thing, but in Malaysia, it's distorted due to our tax structure and some other factors like the national car brands, which are protected in indirect ways. So when you talk about car prices going up, it's very hard to say that they will go up by natural market forces, because those natural market forces have always been influenced by government policies. In fact, over the years, industries' pricing strategies have been greatly policy influenced, and that is not good because you don't allow natural market demand to dictate prices. Now, back in the old days, I don't know whether you are aware of it, locally assembled vehicles actually were under price control. The car assemblers had to submit their costs, and this was only locally assembled models, to the government, which would review the prices, including the profit margin and all, and decide whether it was an acceptable price. If it was not, then they would have to go back and adjust things and all that. So prices were under control, and that created an artificial situation as well. Uh, it was done in the early years. I asked about it to prevent profiteering because in the early years of the car industry in the 60s, some companies were making too much money. So the government decided that to help consumers, it had to keep an eye on how they price their products, which was a good idea. But then over time, it became a liability because manufacturers want to compete, and actually, they're not going to make a lot of money out of a car. So they're not going to simply price their car so high because if people don't want it, also it's not good for business. And that's the way the market should operate. So if you ask me what's going to happen in 1 or 2 years, even right now, prices are being held at a certain level because nobody dares to increase the prices. It has to take a very bold guy to say, I'll increase my price for a while and take a hit because people will go to some other brand, and then everyone sees and follows, and that's how it happens. It takes one or two guys to increase their prices, but right now I don't see prices increasing significantly over the next few years. The only thing that will affect it is exchange rates. If the Malaysian ringgit, loses value, then of course that has an impact on prices, as it did in the mid 1980s when the Japanese yen rose very quickly, and that's why Japanese cars became very expensive very fast.
Okay. Okay, guys, before we end the discussion today, gentlemen, I'd just like to end on a high note. So I'd like to ask you guys, what is your dream car? Or in your opinion, what is the best car in the world to drive and why? I'll start with you first, Yamin.
Hey, my dream car is very simple, man. It is an all-wheel drive fuel cell. It's an all-wheel drive fuel cell off-road vehicle with a hub motor on each wheel. Okay, and they are all connected. And we can go anywhere with this car, even better than the Luna Ranger, man. Okay, that's my dream car. And of course, it is a green hydrogen car, so there's no carbon emissions.
Yes, no harmful emissions, of course. What about you, Chips?
Well, I'm always asked that question, and personally, as I like SUVs, it would have to be an SUV, and I like hybrids. I won't name any particular model because it all depends at the end of the day on the price, and that's
Yeah.
what matters. That's what matters to me. But just two things: SUV and a hybrid, because I believe in hybrids being economical and efficient and lower emission. So that is what my dream car would be, whatever SUV it is.
Okay, so yeah, the best car to drive would be something which is a hybrid and lower emissions. But what would be your dream vehicle if money was no object? What would be your dream vehicle, Chips?
Money was no object. People, immediately people will say Ferrari or Lamborghini or that, but those are actually to me very impractical cars. And again, going back to an SUV, of course, Lamborghini also has an SUV, but I would never buy it because it's so expensive. Even if money is no object, it's still very troublesome to, look after a supercar. So I would probably buy something more practical like a Toyota RAV4, or at my age, probably a Perodua Ativa. I like a Perodua Ativa.
Wow.
support national products. So, it's a simple thing, just run around. I don't drive that much anyway. So why spend so much money on transport, right?
Indeed. That's some very good advice to end the discussion on. Thank you so much, Chips Yap and Yamin Wong, for joining us on today's show.
Thank you very much.
Have a
you.
nice day. Stay safe.
Bye.
Have a nice day. And for our listeners, thank you so much also for spending time with us today. If you missed out on any part of the podcast, do search for us on the Plug-in with MARii channel on Spotify. That's MARII. Search for us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and also many more. Thank you once again for everyone for listening in. We'll see you again next time. Bye.
This is a MARii podcast.